Russian tank production ramps up fivefold, Vladimir Putin says. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has announced a fivefold increase in Russia's main battle tank production since the commencement of its special military operation in Ukraine. This is how Russia refers to its invasion and war in Ukraine. Putin made this statement at the All for Victory Forum. In his declaration about enhancements in both civilian and military industries, Putin drew attention to the significant increase in tank production. Since the operation began, the supply of various types of drones and artillery ammunition to troops has surged, including a tenfold increase for personal armor, sevenfold for automotive equipment, and, notably, a fivefold increase for tanks. A fivefold increase in tanks is quite significant, Putin stated. However, Putin didn't provide precise figures to represent this fivefold rise in tank production. BulgarianMilitary.com refers to a report from December last year issued by the Ministry of Defense that was circulated by the TASS news agency. This report reveals 1,500 tanks and 22,000 drones were provided to the Russian army. The report also noted that 22,000 armored fighting vehicles and 1,400 missile and artillery systems were delivered. UK Defense Intelligence. British Defense Intelligence recently announced that the number of tanks Russia is producing every month is almost equal to the number of tanks being destroyed in Ukraine, averaging around 3 tanks per day. Nevertheless, this intelligence report refers to the monthly production of tanks by the Russian defense industry. Other analysts speculate that this increase doesn't necessarily mean entirely new tanks are being built. Rather, it could involve producing new equipment and upgrading older tanks from the Russian military stockpile. It is suggested that the production of the advanced Russian T-90M Prorev tank presents significant challenges. According to these sources, only 130 units of this modern armor were produced and supplied to the Russian army in 2023. The remaining supplies were sourced by upgrading T-72 and T-80 tanks, which Russia has in large quantities remaining from the Soviet Union era. Putin might not be emphasizing the production of the technologically advanced T-90 tank, but instead, the revival of production lines that were scheduled for cessation. T-80 is back. In September last year, news surfaced about Russia restarting the T-80 tank production. This initiative involves more than just refurbishing or upgrading existing models. It stands for full-scale manufacturing of these battle vehicles from scratch. Alexander Potapov, the esteemed director of Eurovagonzavod concern, revealed this key news. Potapov stated that this order came directly from the military, necessitating negotiations with the Ministry of Industry and Trade due to the requirement for more capacity to restart production. The T-80 BBM, a modern version of the tank, is powered by a robust gas turbine engine with an impressive 1250 horsepower. This innovative feature has been part of the Russian military's armored division since 2019, marking a significant advancement in military technology. Soviet era. During the frosty Cold War era, the Soviet Union had an extensive tank industry, producing more tanks than any other nation at a staggering rate of over 4,000 tanks annually. In the 1980s, this production volume was shared across 5 main factories, notably the Malyshev, Omstrandsmash, and Eurovagonzavod, the main manufacturers of T-64 seconds, T-80 seconds, and cost-effective T-72 seconds. Despite most of these tanks being designated for the Soviet Army, the USSR also exported more tanks than any other country. However, after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, domestic tank orders plummeted drastically. In fact, during the 2010 seconds, only about 10 orders were placed domestically per year. Nonetheless, the annual production remained around 100 tanks for the next 3 decades, with the majority being exported. In the aircraft industry, China was a key customer of the Soviet Union during the 1990s. However, in the case of armored vehicles, India and Algeria have been the main purchasers. Before 2022, these 2 countries had deployed more new T-90 tanks than even the Russian army. It's also worth mentioning that Iran was a significant buyer during the 1990s. However, Moscow was forced to terminate its T-72 export contract with Iran prematurely due to extreme pressure from Washington. 1,500 tanks, Medvedev said. The conflict in Ukraine, which began in February 2022, led to severe losses for the T-72 troops early on. This triggered a sudden increase in production to compensate for the losses incurred during the conflict. Finally, Dmitry Medvedev, former president and current deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, affirmed in March 2023, "We plan to build 1,500 tanks just this year. Imagine the impact this will have on our adversaries, even under the best scenarios." Russian army received 1,900 tanks, and another 200 are expected. Sergei Chemizov, the director of Russia's state-owned company Rostec, has declared a substantial increase in the nation's tank production in 2023, escalating by a striking sevenfold, as stated in various Russian media outlets. Simultaneously, Russian military pundit Viktor Murakovsky ascertains that his assessments show a delivery to the armed forces of approximately 2,100 tanks of diverse varieties in 2023 by the Russian military-industrial complex. Notably, this total encompasses the T-54 55th and T-62 series tanks, along with their subsequent modifications, and concludes with the advanced T-90M Proryv. The scenario painted might appear foreboding, given the previously presumed capacity of the Russian manufacturers to produce roughly 200 of the new T-90M Proryv tanks annually. A thorough perusal of the estimates offered by Murakovsky presents an illuminating perspective. In 2023, the Russian military was supplied with nearly 1,900 tanks, comprising 210 freshly manufactured tanks, 840 modernized T-72B3 tanks, in addition to 840 reinstated T-80, T-72, T-62, and T-55/54 tanks. 2 years prior, the Russian military procured merely 30 fresh production tanks and 120 refurbished units. In stark contrast to this, the year 2020 saw no older models of domestically produced tanks being withdrawn from reserve by Russia. However, this depiction can be vastly contradicted when cross-referenced with alternate sources. Survey experts from the Swedish research institution FOI cite in their report on the Russian Federation's military capacity after 1.5 years of all-out war with Ukraine that the Russian military-industrial division now has the capability of delivering far fewer tanks per annum, approximately 520 units. The breakdown is as follows: 62 units of the T-90M Proryv type and an equal quantity of the T-90 divided by T-90A type, 80 units of T-80 BVM tanks, 140 units each of T-72B3 tanks and T-72B3M tanks. This data exists despite the Swedish FOI's reports proposing pessimistic evaluations of Russia's armored potential, inferring that Russia possesses up to 2,000 varied modification T-64 tanks and approximately 2,800 units of the T-54 55th tank in reserve. Furthermore, their projections speculate that by February 2024, irrespective of current losses and conservative estimation of Russia's defense production capabilities, the Russian army would still maintain a stock of 2,500 to 3,000 tanks. Given these facts, one may surmise that in 2023, the Russian military will likely amass up to 2,100 diverse types of tanks, Russia producing 3 times more artillery shells than US and Europe for Ukraine. Russia appears on track to produce nearly 3 times more artillery munitions than the US and Europe, a key advantage ahead of what is expected to be another Russian offensive in Ukraine later this year. Russia is producing about 250,000 artillery munitions per month, or about 3 million a year, according to NATO intelligence estimates of Russian defense production shared with CNN, as well as sources familiar with Western efforts to arm Ukraine. Collectively, the US and Europe have the capacity to generate only about 1.2 million munitions annually to send to Kiev, a senior European intelligence official told CNN. The US military set a goal to produce 100,000 rounds of artillery a month by the end of 2025, less than half of the Russian monthly output, and even that number is now out of reach with $60 billion in Ukraine funding stalled in Congress, a senior army official told reporters last week. What we are in now is a production war, a senior NATO official told CNN. The outcome in Ukraine depends on how each side is equipped to conduct this war. Officials say Russia is currently firing around 10,000 shells a day, compared to just 2,000 a day from the Ukrainian side. The ratio is worse in some places along the 600-mile front, according to a European intelligence official. The shortfall comes at perhaps the most perilous moment for Ukraine's war effort since Russia first marched on Kiev in February 2022. U.S. money for arming Ukraine has run out, and Republican opposition in Congress has effectively halted giving any more. Meanwhile, Russia recently took the Ukrainian city of Avdiivka and is widely seen as having the initiative on the battlefield. Ukraine is struggling not just with ammunition but also growing manpower shortages on the front lines.